of YBF, which for the listeners out there was on the complete opposite side of the world, with Farley Black operating mostly in the UK and Nova Scotia, and YBF being here in Australia.
Well, fortunately, I met one of the founders back in 2009 at Stanford. We both attended the executive program, and we stayed in touch over the years. In some of my visits to Australia for other work, I would come by and see what York Butter Factory was up to, and usually was for all of about 5 minutes and maybe some ribs and a drink, but stayed in touch. And as York Butter Factory, started to change directions, brought in an external chairman, and decided it needed an externally focused CEO, I kind of got interested. And after 2.5 years in Nova Scotia, and after 15 years in London, spending time between both, both my wife and I were up for a change. So it just seemed to align. I had a lot of fun in the arts, having restored a heritage opera house, and having started an art gallery, and having published a magazine. All fun things, I would say. All cool stuff. I would say not very economically rewarding. A good drain of cash. I'd say the art gallery was actually quite successful and commercially successful, but it was time to do bigger things and probably go back to some more of my business roots. Listen, Australia is not a hard place to want to come to, so that was the easiest of the decisions.
That's amazing. And as you were deciding whether or not to take the role with YBF, did you have any prior experience or understanding of co-working spaces and innovation hubs? Have you seen that previously in your career?
No, I certainly haven't. At BP, we had, a ton of offices spread around the world. So I hadn't experienced this. I guess where there was direct experience was when I used to run procurement for BP. I looked after property and facilities for the company. So, what we do here is certainly partially a property and facilities play. Having run the Opera House, having organized and hosted massive events, and having run basically a massive space, I guess gave me some indirect, if not direct, experience. But no, this was a new space, and probably a bit surprising, my first day here.
Yeah. And, going back to that again, your first day here, I've been in YBF since 2012, and I can confidently say that YBF's growth only really, really started the moment you took reins as CEO of the company. And that was quite a shift for the company. I think, we were YBF was one of the first co-working spaces in Australia, one of the first ones to do corporate partnerships, but we never really scaled to the extent that we are today. So as you came into the company, and as you looked at where the YBF of the past was, what was your headspace at in terms of what needed to happen for the company to grow and to scale? Because I could probably say that we weren't ready for that growth when you came in, but we certainly are now. So how did you bridge that gap for the company?
Yeah, listen, let me start off and talk about what was so exciting and what was done so well at YBF. So YBF started in 2011 with an idea that really hadn't made its way to Australia, but was certainly chugging along in the US and accelerating quickly. So, Darcy and Stu, the two founders, started a very small fund of $3 million and needed a place to host their investments. It was that simple. Darcy, Stu, and yourself, Jason, took the company to a place where not only was there a focus on the startups and helping them to scale, but on helping corporates to innovate. It was done out of a very, very small space, and I would say it was done in an ad hoc manner. That works for a certain amount of time, and then it needs to change. So YBF's no different. The YBF today is no different than any other company. Companies go through cycles where they kind of accelerate, which York Butter Factory did, and then they plateau and potentially decline unless an intervention is made. This goes back to my earlier comments around interventions and the need for them. York Butter Factory was no different. So when I came in 2017, the ideas and the foundation were all there, but they were plateauing, and in reality they were declining. All right, and it needed needed a bit of an intervention. It needed a bit of a catalyst for change. It probably needed a bit of an irritant. And I guess I served that role. We made some tough calls very, very early on. So I came in here in mid 2017. We had a space that was really neat and cool back in 2011 and 12 and 13, but the world had caught up and surpassed it. So we needed to find another space. Like most small companies, capital is the biggest challenge. And as I said, I think early in my days with Stratagem, if you don't have cash and capital to grow, growth actually kills you and you suffer for it. York Butter Factory at the time was in that place. So we had to make some courageous and brave choices, which we did. We acquired a business called Team Square, which enabled us to grow our footprint by 6 times, to grow our membership by 10x. It enabled us to approach the government and secure a grant that was in the works. And it set the tone for a different company, and therefore the name from York Butter Factory to YBF. Our recent takeover, our recent ownership of the formerly known Tyro FinTech Hub is the example of that. So 2018 was about growing tremendously, creating a new YBF with a bigger footprint, with a bigger impact, restarting corporate innovation, focusing our message to be really clear that we are here to help startups scale up succeed, and corporates to innovate. And all we do is around creating the ecosystem that enables that. Our move to Sydney this year formalizes that even more. And if we can have, one big announcement each year for the next several years, I think we'll be on a good track. If we can do 2, even better.
Even better. One of the things that I think you've really encapsulated that really well. One of the things that you've done for YBF is that you're a problem solver, essentially. You get down to the root of things. You find a way to solve problems, whether the problem is growth or whether the problem is culture. You somehow manage to distill that into something that's really manageable for a company, regardless of its size, whether it's a BP or a YBF. How do you approach that problem-solving methodology in your head?
Yeah, listen, I'm not sure there's a specific formula for it. I think you just need to cut through the crap pretty quickly. I think if you think there is a sacred cow or a sacred part of the business, whether it be big or small, then you're going to start to ring fence what you can and can't do. You need to quickly identify where the problem areas, and you need to be decisive. You need to make the choices quickly and get into action. I think it's too easy not to.
Yeah, and one of the things you do really well is you're incredibly transparent as well. I think anyone who's dealt with you will know that you're extremely straight to the point, but I'm sure that also shapes people the wrong way sometimes. So it takes a bit of adapting for a lot of people to get used to, but has that always been your approach to things?
Yeah, listen, I am absolutely transparent. I would say it's a strength, but it's also something that can be quite challenging. So listen, I think you and I had some challenging in the beginning, right? I'm not sure you were ready for the transparency that I brought on. Was I, Jason?
No, I was not. There you go, transparency in action right here on the podcast.
Yeah, so I think what transparency does, and I don't pretend that I'm perfect at it at all, but I think what transparency does is it gets the real issue on the table really, really quickly, and then it allows people to solve for it. It's not always comfortable, but it's in that discomfort that a breakthrough can be made, and that's my philosophy. I thought about this long and hard as I went through BP. My transparency is not a natural fit to a company like BP. I mean, BP started off as a British part of the British government, right? And for folks that have spent time in Britain, it is a reserved society. I'm not a reserved individual. So I had to think through, how do I want to drive the changes that I want to, and what am I willing to fail at, and what am I willing to succeed at? And at the end of the day, I thought it's really important for me to be authentic to who I am as a person. And one of those things is putting it all on the table for discussion. It means I need to listen as well. And, I think I do okay at that. I could probably do better. But getting issues on the table so that we can all try to find a solution for it allows companies to move at pace and tackle the real issues. I mean, one of the things I use as an analogy as well is if you're an alcoholic and you don't admit you're an alcoholic, you have no chance of fixing that disease, okay? And it's when you admit you have a problem that you can actually go after and solve the problem. Too many companies don't admit they have a problem.
And why do you think people struggle to be transparent? Because it sounds logical when you're explaining why you're transparent, but in the real world, a lot of people still struggle with being honest, with being open, especially in the startup world sometimes, where you kind of have to put on this facade of success and growth. It's hard to sometimes admit that you're struggling or to admit that there are issues on the table. Why do you think people struggle through that?
I don't know. Listen, if you live in a two-dimensional world, it's impossible to know there's a third dimension. And I think for me, I'm transparent. So it's kind of hard for me to get my head around that people aren't. Now, with that said, I'm certainly smart enough to realize that most people are not as transparent as I am. I guess I've got a bit of a personal risk profile that allows me to be transparent and allows the positives to come from that, but also allows the negatives to come from that. It's not for everybody. A lot of people need the safety and security of the status quo. What gets me up in the morning is actually what's beyond the status quo. What could something be like? Talking a big game and self-promoting is absolutely boring to me. I would much rather have our customers, have our partners talk about our successes than us. And I think the only way you allow that to happen is by being transparent, figuring out what's broken, helping to fix it, and winning. And I think winning is great. Let's let other people talk about us winning rather than us.
That's awesome. And great advice for listeners out there as well. One of the things that YBF does is YBF describes itself as an innovation hub that's beyond coworking. What does beyond coworking mean? And where does beyond coworking fit within the broader market, whether it's coworking or corporate innovation?
Yeah, listen, I think the future will be the judge whether there is a beyond coworking and whether our view of the world is true or not. Our belief is based on the following, that early on, there was a single relationship between tenants and landlords. That's the traditional way a business worked in a space. Regis came around and created version 1, if you will, which was the serviced office approach. It allowed the variabilization of office space. WeWork, we like to consider as version 2, all right? And they are focused on co-working. And what is co-working? It's really around community. We believe WeWork's approach is a passive community. I think they would probably differ with my definition of that. But, the belief that there's a kombucha tap and that kombucha tap creates magic is probably a bit of a fallacy, and I think it'll change over time. Version 3 of co-working, if you will, and what we like to call beyond co-working, is instead of a passive community, it's an active community. How do you actively encourage things to happen? How do you facilitate and co-create? How do you curate conversations? How do you actively put businesses together rather than believing that grabbing a beer around a common kitchen is enough? We don't believe it's enough. We staff at multiple levels of a co-working space. I'll go back to what I said earlier, is that we are here to help startups scale up, succeed, and corporates to innovate. You only do that by actively managing the relationships, the interactions, broadening the ecosystem well beyond the walls. We have 3,100 square meters of space here in Melbourne. That's interesting. What's really more interesting for us is 3,100 square meters of space allows us to have 75 companies that call YBF home, allows us to have 400 members that come in on a daily basis or certainly call us home on a membership level, and allows us to have an ecosystem of 49,000 people. So our growth strategy, imagine if everything was 10x that. So instead of 3,100 square meters of space, again, the least important number here, what if it was 31,000 square meters of space, which is about 330,000 square feet of space, mouthful. Imagine if we're able to look after 750 companies, 4,000 members, and an ecosystem of 500,000 people that interact with and help us help startups to scale, scale-ups to succeed, and corporates to innovate. That's really the goal of YBF, and that's beyond coworking.
And when you say active community, what do you mean by active community? What role does YBF play to really catalyze those interactions within the community?
It's a variety of things. It's not one thing. It can be really as light as doing whatever every other co-working space does, which is to provide some passive ways for people to interact. Okay, the difference we do even in those passive events, if you will, is that because we have more people, we are able to be there present and actually encourage people to talk to each other. Okay, rather than just putting 10 people in a room and walking away, we put 10 people in a room, but there's 2 or 3 of us in addition to those 10. That makes a big difference. If we know that a startup is looking for a raise, then we will start to make introductions to investors, to other companies that can help on the journey. We will take a founder that has never done a raise before and make sure they are able to talk to 1, 2, 3, or 10 other founders that actually have done a Series A, B, or C. So it's those active activities. It requires a bigger staff, but it fundamentally provides a value add that doesn't exist elsewhere.
That's cool. And was this what you envisaged yourself doing when you first took over the reins of YBF?
No, I guess not. I probably didn't get a accurate picture of what YBF or York Butter Factory was. So we had to quickly, I would say, relaunch, which we've done. And thanks to you, I mean, you're key to this. You've been here since 2012. You provide a bridge to the history and the foundations and everything that has made York Butter Factory, now YBF, a known commodity and a respected business. And it's thanks to all the new people, Joe behind the cameras here is one, that actually are taking us to the place we need to be. But gosh, it'd be boring if that wasn't the case, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's a good segue into my next question. You mentioned, that this isn't just a one-person effort. This is a team effort. And having run teams across large organizations and startups, what are some of the common ingredients to creating a high-performing team?
Yeah, listen, high-performing teams are essential. I think if you don't have them, you're going to always struggle. So I think being clear on what the expectations are. So I think it starts at the recruiting process, to be honest. I think you need to be honest, and we use the word transparent again, but you need to be transparent. I think selling someone on something that is only a dream doesn't help. So, and I'll use my BP days when we were going after really big challenges and problems in the company, and we were the countercultural element to it. My recruiting pitch sounded more like a recruiting pitch for the U.S. Marine Corps. The U.S. Marine Corps, for those that don't know it, had an advertisement that said "the few, the proud, the Marines," and it had a bunch of people working really hard and pictures of boot camp and all these things that were difficult. And when I recruited people, I said, "Listen, this is going to be tough. If you are up for a challenge, you're the right folks. If you are able to live with ambiguity, then great. If you want a structured, standard, status quo role, this isn't for you. If you want an easy life, this isn't for you. If you want to do something exceptional and you want to be exceptional, then come to us." I'd say that's the same thing in the startup world. If folks aren't willing to step up, stand out, do things differently, they're not right for most companies, especially ones that are trying to scale, trying to grow, trying to innovate. And that's the culture that I've always looked to build. So, building a high performance team starts with those expectations. In the recruiting cycle, I think where we've fallen down, and whether that be at YBF or BP or any other company, is when those expectations either aren't set or they're not heard. It just doesn't set up the right solution. I think once folks are recruited in, then, it's a balance. It's a balance of a bit of tough love, with certainly acknowledging wins, while at the same time always looking to improve and think better. I think for me, because I am as transparent as I am, and that can be seen as being quite tough, it's really important for me to surround myself with balanced leaders. And I think that's the case for anybody else. So if you're on the other side and you are a much more quiet leader, a more thoughtful leader, someone that is more risk adverse, then you need to surround yourself with team members that are willing to take the risk or take the hill on your behalf. So it's finding that balance in teams. And I think we're in a good place with YBF. The team has changed completely since I took over. Jason, you're here.
I am.
and the rest of the team is new.
Yep.
We're now 55% female. We're actually 11 people. Our 12th person is on sabbatical right now. Out of those 11 or 12 people, depending how you measure it, we come from 8 countries. We speak 5 languages, and we're 50 to 55% female, whether you're counting Darcy or not, who's in the Amazon right now.
And YBF is obviously going through a period of growth right now. YBF is now in Sydney. Could you talk to us a bit about the move into Sydney and what that means for YBF?
Yeah, Sydney's always been important for us. So growth is important, and it goes back to my earlier comments that it's not about the square meterage or the square footage. It's not about the number of floors. It's not about the number of sites directly, but indirectly, all those things enable us to look after a larger number of companies, a larger number of members, and create a larger ecosystem in order to drive success, to drive scale, and to drive innovation. Sydney was always going to be important to us. We did a pilot earlier on. We learned a lot in that pilot. And, in 2019, we were ready to do it ourselves, which is why we waited and why we executed upon the Sydney space we have now. Sydney gives us a 38% increase in size, and therefore a 38% increase in number of companies we look after. We have a long-term strategy. I guess, again, time will be the judge whether we are able to execute on it or not. But we really want to create a triangle, if you will, between Australia, New Zealand, and generally Southeast Asia. Okay, and that Southeast Asia is a really big geography, but there are benefits to all of those areas individually, and there are massive benefits to creating an ecosystem that bridges all of them. So our goal is to be in Melbourne and Sydney, potentially places like Brisbane. We really want to be in New Zealand, Auckland, and likely Wellington, and whether it's Singapore, KL, Jakarta, somewhere in Vietnam, Thailand, all of those things, or some of them individually, that is the future strategy of this company.
That's great. And before we wrap up, I have one last question for you, Farley.
Sure.
If someone wanted to learn more about YBF, if it was a startup looking to scale, or a scale up looking to succeed, or a corporate looking to innovate, or even just anyone who's interested in YBF, what should they do to reach out?
Well, listen, you can reach out through any number of ways. We're all really active on social. This podcast is, our commitment to getting out there and being heard and being visible. We're all on LinkedIn. We have a website. Our contacts are all on that. I'd say just reach out. Just come in and see us if you're in town, or send us an email, or any other way you want. We're here.
That's great. And Farley, I learned a lot of new things from you today on this podcast. So, so thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks,
and
Jason.
For listeners out there, stay tuned to watch how YBF continues to grow. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.